It's all lies, I promise, especially about the funny and great part. Thank you so much, Change the Game and Sport for Life, for asking me to give this keynote today. So I'm going to start off with some controversy, as I tend to like to do in my lectures, especially with my students, and try and take you on a little bit of a journey, and maybe some the ability to reorientate some of your thinking around physical literacy, or the way we might think about it as we move forward. So I put the references up front, but you can have access to the slides at your will. These are just the papers that I've worked on that and colleagues have worked on that have informed some of the content that is in this keynote. So, go back. So there's a plethora of promotional material and anecdote and research and people claiming evidence that exercise and physical activity is the magic pill for all things in all places, in all contexts. And as the literature has grown in this area, I'm starting to think we can somewhat invest too much in what we think physical activity alone is capable of. And many of you would have seen literature in your own countries and promotional materials that look something like this. Lots of anecdote around that. More active kids learn better, they do better on test scores. You'll see lots of pictures of brain images and sketchy drawn graphs that if we get kids active, they're going to learn better, and people are going to learn better. So the question, that leads us to begging the question: do we actually need a new concept, or do we need to re-envisage a concept like physical literacy if physical activity alone, the concept of just getting people active for active's sake, is going to achieve all these wonderful outcomes? Now, I take a bias. I'm a pedagogue, so I'm interested in learning. So when people tell me that if you're physically active, you're a better learner, I want to investigate, well, is that enough? So what I want to take you on is a bit of a journey of the evidence that sits around physical activity and learning. Okay? So the first one is this, I'm going to report a bunch of bell curves to you, right? Essentially all the data, I've tried to break it down as simple as possible. I do a lot of work in meta-analyses. So most of you would know what a meta-analysis is put a whole bunch of all the studies that have been published in a particular area looking at an outcome, and then try to determine the size of the effect. So I'm not interested in whether things are statistically significant or not, because it gives us no indication of size. Right? Just that one is statistically better than the other. It actually doesn't tell us how big or the intensity of that effect. So what I'm going to report for you today is a series of curves that show you the differences in effect between different types of interventions that have used physical activity, that have used different modes of physical activity, and coupled it to learning. So the first one is, guess what? Everything that we do in schools typically has a positive effect on learning. There are very few things that we do with kids that actually makes them go backwards. If you want to know, the couple of things that actually make them go backwards are having them repeat school, right? Or summer holidays, believe it or not, tends to have a little bit of a backwards effect. But for the most part, nearly everything that we do in a learning environment improves learning. Surprise, surprise. Right? So it's not good enough for researchers and policies to say this intervention has a positive effect. Everything does. So what we need to actually quantify is and draw a line is how big, where are our best investments? What is likely to generate the biggest effects in learning? Now, John Hattie did a really seminal work on this, and it's called Visible Learning, if those of you haven't come across it. And he essentially, looking at over 1,000 meta-analyses, looked at all the things that happen in schools that affect achievement. And he says that of all the interventions we run, the average effect size, the mean effect size of all the interventions done in school is about 0.4 of a standard deviation. So a Cohen's d of 0.4. And that's what the curve looks like. That's the average. So there's another, those of you who are interested in meta-analyses, they use a series of thresholds, but the one I want to talk to you about here is the threshold of 0.5. So when you move a population's achievement or change of behavior by half a standard deviation. Now, Michael Bornstein, who really wrote the textbook on meta-analysis, basically says is in clinical interventions, 0.5 of a standard deviation shift is observable behavior change. To give you a case in point, children who suffer from Asperger's, right? The difference in half a standard deviation is you can tell when they've taken their medication or not. All right, so those of you who have worked with children in those sorts of settings, you can see the difference between when they've taken their medication and when they haven't, so you kind of know. So when we think about and I'm very much interested, as you'll find in this lecture, interested in observable behavior change around interventions. 0.5 is a threshold where you could walk into a school or you could walk into a coaching class and you would say, there's something different about this class. They've received something that other people haven't because it's observable to the naked eye. Does that make sense? So if you keep those two thresholds in your mind over this lecture, you'll be able to say, are we investing in the best possible interventions that we can to improve learning? So there was in 2017, there was actually a meta-analysis that looked at 26 studies that were reporting effect sizes that physical activity improved achievement in children, or learning in children. Or learning was reported in terms of academic achievement. For the most part, it was reported how well they do on standardized tests in math, reading, language, and IQ type composite scores. Okay? So, how big was the effect? Right? 26 studies around the world that had done it well. It shifts the curve 0.19 of a standard deviation, which in meta-analytic terms, we'd consider negligible to small when we measure cognitive learning. Just so you know, if you get kids to just practice taking those tests, you get an effect size of 0.22. You can start to see the quagmire we find ourselves in if we find ourselves arguing for physical activity breaks or more physical activity in schools or physical activity for the sake of it because it's going to boost child's test score performance. Because a principal or a teacher can turn around and say, I can get a bigger effect by just having them practice the exam I'm about to give them. That effect size essentially only increases or is likely to represent an increase in about 6% of students treated. So when you read stuff or when you read research that says that physical activity impacts cognitive learning, well, it does. But the effect size is relatively small. So, begs the question, when we look at some of the, when we go into the meta-regression, so we're actually looking at how much variance is accounted for in those 26 studies, what's interesting, and this surprised me, is that dose showed no relationship. Surely the argument that they're making in this research material is more active kids are going to be better learners. But when you do the regression, there is no relationship between physical activity dose and academic achievement. Made me start to ask some new questions. The other thing that it showed that there was significant publication bias in those studies. So think about it, studies that reported activity and exercise increased cognitive learning are more likely to get published in good journals, as opposed to people that published work that said, we found no difference. Right? And the funnel plot analysis, it was a very good meta-analysis, by the way, and I encourage you to read it, showed that there was significant publication bias. One other thing I want to say, of the 26 studies poured up in the meta-analysis, only 2 of the interventions coupled physical activity with some learning imperative. Okay, so they coupled physical activity with learning about mathematics, or learning about language, or learning about reading. The rest were essentially activity alone interventions. So this concerned me for a couple of reasons. First one is I don't think we can define learning just by its cognitive output. Cognitive learning is one of 4 domains of learning that we traditionally look at, or we typically look at in terms of someone's development. I was particularly interested in the effect it also had on affective learning. So what motivates us to learn? And the reason I'm interested in that is because children that are motivated to learn probably are going to learn better in other areas. And obviously, because of the medium of learning, in other words, we learn through our bodies, I'm interested in psychomotor development as well. So one of my master's student, Raywin, and I, earlier this year, this is in press at the moment, but you can get it ahead of time. What we thought is we don't understand this lack of dose response with physical activity. So could we extract a number of studies around the world that did nothing more than increase the proportion of physical education time kids receive? We didn't look at studies that changed the program. We didn't look at studies that put in an intervention. We only looked at studies that said kids have PE once a week, now they're going to get it twice. Or kids have PE once a week, now they're going to move to a daily PE model. We only extracted studies where the increase in frequency and curriculum allocation to kids undertaking PE was applied, and we built this into our model. So, what effect does that have? So now we've got movement coupled with some type of learning imperative. Well, interesting enough, if you just increase frequency, no surprises, they do about the same on those standardized tests, about 0.14 of a standard deviation. It's almost identical to the physical activity interventions. Bit disappointing, because maybe PE alone is enough to drive up those test scores. Well, it's not. They don't go backwards, but they don't go forwards either in any meaningful way. But there's more to learning. If we increase the proportion of physical education in schools, are they motivated to learn in other areas? Does it improve their affective learning outcomes? Well, now we get to see some interesting data. Schools that increase the frequency of PE get effect sizes of over half a standard deviation. Essentially, 22% of students are more motivated to learn in school when we increase the frequency of the PE lesson. Nice. Well, does it have any impact on their psychomotor learning? Well, I'd hope so. Otherwise, we're all out of it. Well, those are pedagogues in the room, you're out of a job. Well, good news, if you do nothing more than change your practice and increase the frequency, it jumps by about 0.83 of a standard deviation. Okay? So when we start to measure motor competence and fundamental movement skills, we start to see a nice relationship between physical activity lessons, physical education that they're exposed to, and their development of motor competence. The 0.83 of a standard deviation represents an increase in 30% of your students in your class. Okay, and that's just based on dose. So, any Mad Men fans in the room? Don Draper is one of my heroes. So I'm coming on one of the quote he dropped in the episode. If you don't like what's been said, you need to change the conversation. And this notion that we just get kids active and they're going to learn isn't enough. So I want to change the conversation. And really what sparked me to do that was a paper written by my former PhD examiner, who's one of the authors on there, and actually some friends of mine, at least all but one of those authors I know personally. But this paper came out in 2012 where Salas and colleagues were essentially arguing that the reason that physical education wasn't having an impact on NCDs, wasn't having an impact on academic achievement, wasn't having an impact on why people said PE had a role in schools, was because that education had failed to adopt public health goals. And the essential argument of this paper was that the first and foremost priority in physical education needs to be achieving physical activity guidelines, right? If you get other things behind it, if you get kids that have better value and social skill and teamwork, they actually argue that that's the role of every subject area, and that's a nice spin-off, but you need to focus on the MVPA. We need to get kids moving and more active. That's the primary focus. But I also thought that what would happen if we switched that? What if we changed that argument? Rather than focus on the MVPA, what if we focus on how and why and when kids learn? Does that have an effect on those same outcomes, but in a different way? So let's drill into this a little bit. So what I did was, this is some research that I haven't published yet, but I'm working on it currently with my master's student I mentioned before. So I took 83 studies that had been published in the literature between 2017 and 1980. 83 studies that compared different models of instruction in PE. The first one were focused on the health-driven, the fitness-driven PE models, where they did exactly what Salas had argued. Let's get people active and fit in the time we have appointed to physical education. That's going to be your focus. That's going to be your impetus. The second group of studies I pulled down had learning goals as their primary outcome. So you'd be familiar with some of these models. Sport Education by Daryl Seidentop, anyone familiar with that sort of stuff? So where we learn about the roles and the different activities that we do in physical education. We learn how to officiate. We learn how to keep score and do the statistics. We learn all facets of sport participation. Also brought down TGFU, Teaching Games for Understanding, game-centered pedagogies, right? So where the tactical decision making is the impetus and how students solve that. I brought down cooperative learning, physical education models, and built that into my model as well. So where it was more about how students work together to solve common problems that were presented in movement scenarios. And then I wanted to look at what effect that kind of those teaching models had on student behavior. Well, the first one I looked at was what effect did it have on motivation for children to be physically active? So when we took those effective learning outcomes and we asked them how motivated are you to be active, or whatever instrument they used, what effect did those physical health and fitness driven models have? And Salas is right. He can claim that, that students are motivated to be physically active in those models. But the effect size is tiny. 0.15 of standard deviation, exactly the same as what we saw in academic achievement almost. If you adopt those fitness, health-driven models in your PE, you're only going to affect 4% or see improvements in 4% of your students. Conversely, when we take the learning-driven model, it looks like this. So when we get them problem-solving, decision-making, focusing on how they interact with teams, we get motivations to be active that are nearly half a standard deviation. That's enough to walk into a room and see a noticeable difference in children that are motivated to be active. 16% of students are more likely to have a favourable outcome in that model. I took it one step further. Do they actually learn skills in the psychomotor outcomes? Do they become more motor competent? Well, in the health and fitness-driven model, rightly so, it's almost exactly the same. Again, 0.13 of a standard deviation. In the health fitness-driven model, only 4% of students are likely to have a favourable outcome compared to the controls. What effect does it have in our learning-driven models? 22% of students. So this is where I see physical literacy moving forward. We need to think about physical literacy, about learning. And it's more than just what they do on a standardized test score. Now we're starting to see about that they do become more motor competent, and so they have the confidence and the competence to be active. I took this one step further. I ran a small pilot study in New South Wales primary schools a couple of years ago. It was published in 2018. The study ran in 2016, 2017. And it's interesting because John Carney presented in one of his, not his keynote, but his session yesterday, where he said they were working with young children and coupling sort of these other learning activities, learning to read and other learning to do math problems, through movement. And this idea sort of fascinated me is, does this actually have an impact on activity of kids when you take it away? So do they make that leap between learning to move to solve math problems or language problems, and then are they more active when you let them go? So we ran a study where we went into schools. We went into 20 schools, but half of them, or less of those, were the actual intervention schools. And we went into the playground. And we worked with the teachers and we said, if we just spray can and stencils, right? And we said, if you were to teach mathematics outside, or mathematics through movement, could we create like a grid pattern that had numbers on it and different types of mathematical equations? Could we put a map down and you could teach geography? Could we put letters down and you could play a series of movement word games? Essentially, we did it all around the school. Okay, and then we went out and manipulated even stuff in the playground on the grassed areas, so they could. And then we worked with the teachers, worked through their programs, and said, well, you're teaching a math class. Let's see how you can teach the times tables so kids use their bodies and they're outside and do it. So what the teachers did is they would take at their whim. We didn't force them. Whenever they felt appropriate to take the kids out for learning into an outside endeavour, the kids would learn mathematics, social science, language through movement. I didn't measure their learning output here. Right? What I was interested in is what effect when the kids were in free play, so in other words in their recess and lunch breaks, were they more active during the school day? Because I actually thought it might have the opposite effect. They're more tired now, but maybe movement becomes boring because the teachers said it's all about arithmetic. But we went into the schools and we said, well, did it impact their activity levels? Well, the amount of vigorous physical activity that were occurring in our intervention schools increased by 0.4 of a standard deviation. 13% of students in the school were more active now at recess and lunch. And part of that was, and when I go through it, part of it was that students were more motivated to be active. The second part was that we showed teachers that kids running around and jumping and climbing isn't deviant behaviour. We changed the culture in these schools that actually, they're playing a game that I taught them in geography. Or, you know what? I'll let them go if they're climbing on chairs or jumping over stuff because I can see learning imperative that might be behind it. A pretty startling effect. If anyone's got a bucket of money, I'd like to replicate the study somewhere else. Okay, so I've got a bit of time. That's okay. So not long after that study was published, we were approached by Sport Australia, who had started to read some of the work that John and Dean and myself and some colleagues around the world had been publishing. Some colleagues back home, I'll mention Lisa Barnett from Deakin University and Richard Keegan from University of Canberra. We had been working in this area and we were approached by the Sports Commission, somewhat blindly, who said, we're interested in physical literacy, but we're not necessarily happy with the way everyone else in the world has gone about it. We want it to be our own. Like everything, they want to colonise everything. They've got to own it, right? But it was a legitimate question. Right? They saw flaws in different strategies that had been used to operationalise physical literacy around the world, and they weren't convinced that anything that was currently in place was going to significantly shift the practice of schools, of sporting organisations in a new light. So they came to us and said, can you build something from scratch? Yeah. How much money have you got? We can try. We can have a crack at it. But one of the first things that we did was a bit of a needs analysis. Why do you even want to be in the physical literacy market? You know, you're a sporting organisation. Show what are your motives behind it? Well, when we asked them that question, it was really interesting what came across the table. Well, first, there was this trend of declining participation in organised sport. I mean, that's no surprise. It's happening in a lot of Western countries. But more importantly, behind that, there's every successful intervention, or not successful, every intervention that they had tried to sustain with school partnerships. They spent over $30 million on a project called Sporting Schools, which it's still running, by the way. But the largely ineffective. Right? The transition of getting kids out of school into organised sport has been really, really poor. Sport sits within the Department of Health in Australia, so there was becoming increasing pressure that they had to pick up some of the NCD burden. So they were interested in activity, and there was this overlay that, you know, public health had put pressure on us. How can we have a conversation with them? And there was also a number of incidents that happened around the time that we were doing this work where we'd say the ethical pressures associated with sport. So there's been a rampant uptake of gambling associated with sport in Australia. It's actually endemic. It's quite sad. We're seeing increased youth violence around sport, both on the weekends and in school settings. And you know, even so much as a national team being caught cheating in an international event. So those of you who watch cricket, you know that we had a number of players suspended for a ball tampering incident, and it was brought national shame basically to. I still don't like talking about it, but what we saw was that this was more than just a physical activity and participation argument. That they actually wanted to shift markedly the culture that underpinned Australian sports participation. So based on that left us with an argument that we could say, well, really, you want to teach people to think and move and act in different ways. So really, we're talking about a concept of learning. That's got to be more than something you're going to quantify with meeting physical activity guidelines. So we needed more than just, you know, every kid will play an organised sport, or every kid will do 30 minutes or 60 minutes of physical activity a day. They still push the guidelines pretty hard, I must admit. But there was something deeper that needed to be solved. So how do we take them on this journey? One is that we had to say that they were kind of right when they said we don't want the UK model, we don't want the Canadian model, we don't want the American model, we don't want the Swedish model, sorry. They said we want something entirely unique, we want a brand new way of thinking about physical literacy. And like most things, Lisa, Richard and I were really perplexed. You want us to go back to the drawing board and invent this. So one of the things that we did is we were thinking about, well, how do we model this? How do we organise our thinking around this idea of physical literacy? That's totally new. And as serendipity would have it, at the time I was at the University of Birmingham working with some scholars. Anyone from Birmingham here? Yeah, you are. So the sport and exercise science, right next to chemistry. They moved the guest talk I was doing there into chemistry. Into that, and I thought, oh great, I'm going to get great attendance to this, right? And whilst I was there was a picture of this guy. Anyone know who that is? Be brave. Come on, Krelaz, who is it? No? Yeah, Dmitri Mendeleev, right? Considered the founding father of the periodic table of elements, right? So the thing that not many people know about Mendeleev is he was not the only scholar working on the periodic table at the time, right? There was actually 9 prominent scientists trying to organize what we knew about the known elements of the world at the time into a visual representation. The genius of Mendeleev was is that he acknowledged that we didn't know everything. This is the modern periodic table, but when Mendeleev did his first one, there were only 60 known elements. What he did is said, this is what we know, but we'll leave space in our model when people discover new knowledge, discover these new elements, and we'll backfill them. So when we were working with the Australians, we said, well, we know some things. We know that motivation is about physical literacy, and we know that decision making is in physical literacy, and we know that locomotion is part of it. All these things are scattered all over the place, so random elements. We know that they exist. We don't necessarily know all of them, and we don't necessarily know exactly where they fit. But Mendeleev also built in the beauty that it was predictive. He started to say there's probably something between lead and, I forget the other element, but I can't remember. There's probably something between here and here, and it's probably going. Galilean was the element that they discovered, because he said that there's got to be something that sits between these two elements. We don't know what it is, but I'm sure it'll be discovered. And surprise, surprise, 100 years later, we discovered an element that sat with the same properties that he predicted. So we actually wanted to build a model that had predictive components to it. It would recognize what scholars had already done, but it would leave space if people discovered new components that fit the physical literacy model or the physical literacy idea, that we could include them. So the first thing, if I go back there, one of the things you notice about the periodic table is it's organized, right? They group the elements based upon their properties. So we asked ourselves a question: could we group these elements the way they had scattered? Locomotion over here, decision making over here, motivation over here, values and ethics over here, teamwork over here. All these things, people said, well, we were like, yep, that's part of physical. Yep, that's part of physical literacy. So we had to group them, and that's exactly what we did. What we started to see is when we thought about it from a learning perspective, we could group everything that was being said into one of the 4 learning domains that scholars speak about. Is it a physical learning? Psychological is just affect, social learning, or cognitive learning. What was interesting is that we had our first breakthrough in terms of discovering a new, previously undefined physical element. I wrote in a 2015 paper that it's more than just locomotion, stability, and object manipulation. I introduced a new term called object locomotion. I wanted to incorporate how people used a surfboard or a bicycle or a skateboard. How do we manipulate a secondary object that combined was a little bit of stability, a little bit of manipulation, and a little bit of locomotion, but it was actually something quite unique. And it found its way into this model. It was called moving using equipment. Now, this is not the academic interpretation of it. We used for a lot of these things, more complicated terms. But this was how it came out of the wash when we ran it past stakeholders. So after we could group them, we thought that this was a bit of a win, but we were still confronted with what else the periodic table did was periodize them. Was there a way to weigh them or measure these elements in terms of depth? Well, that took a bit more effort. So, whenever I get stuck on a problem, I try and look backwards, because I don't consider I'm smart enough to invent new knowledge. And quite often that you'll find that good science replicates itself over time. So one of the problems we were confronted with was there were a lot of these things, like we were talking about values, we were talking about ethics, we were talking about decision making, and a lot of people said you can't see decision making, right? You can't see this, or you can't see ethics. Okay. And it was a fairly legitimate concern. So looking back, where are the Danes in the room? Anyone from Denmark? Danish mathematician, George Roche. Right? George Roche used to get incredibly frustrated with social scientists who would claim, you don't understand my phenomenon because you can't see what I know. Right? Used to frustrate him to no end. And he would argue, he said, well, actually, if you learn something, it should manifest in a behavior change. All right? And I'll give you an example of things that maybe you can't see, or you think you can't see, but you measure all the time. Right? Can you see temperature? Can you see temperature? Can you measure it? Well, actually, it's a bit of a no-mo. You don't see temperature, and you don't really measure temperature. What you measure is a manifestation of temperature, right? So what we know is that mercury responds in a certain way. It expands in a vacuum when this idea or this concept of temperature increases, and it contracts when it decreases. Yeah? Or think about speed, right? You can't measure speed. What you do is you measure manifestations of speed, right? And the odometer goes up as the engine spins faster. You get a reading. They're very accurate ways, but they're not the only ways we measure temperature or the only ways we measure speed. I'll give you an example. As you become more exposed to a behavior or people eliciting a behavior, you notice their behaviors change when this other concept starts to manifest. I'll give you an example. This picture is taken out front of my house. Same wave. I'm measuring temperature. How? What they're wearing, right? So this is exactly the same wave, different times of the year, and it's not as accurate as the thermometer. But because I live in that environment and I know how not just one, but multiple people behaviors group when the water changes temperature, I would estimate for the guy on the right to be wearing a full steamer wetsuit. Two things: he's either a wimp or the water temperature. The water temperature is probably below about 16 or probably below about 14 degrees centigrade, because to put that much of a wetsuit on means that it's not probably only just cold in the water, there's probably a bit of a wind chill as well. Right? In terms of wearing a board short, I can't make as accurate a temperature because it could basically be anywhere from about 21 upwards. All right? But I could look for other things. I could look for perspiration. What I could look for is how does these behaviors change over time? And teachers do this all the time. How many times have they been in a classroom and they introduce an intervention and they see a kid's behavior change as a result of they're sitting with a different child, or they're learning a different thing, or they've actually understood something? The trick is training people to be observant enough to capture the difference. And to do that, we need to give them instruments that they can defend those judgments when they occur. Okay? So we can't rely on just anecdote. And I've heard people say it before, I know I'm having an effect. I know I make a difference. People smile or they come to class. Oh, that's great. What I want you to do is what we want you to do is have a common understanding of what that looks like so we can capture it and we can share that conversation with others. That's how we build good evidence. So we looked for a measurement tool, and the one that we use, and I have a particular bias to, is this structure of observed learning outcomes. Most of you would be familiar with with Bloom's taxonomy. Yeah, the educators in the room. It informs a lot of educators. Anyone familiar with Solo? Yes. Anybody else? A few people around the room may have done it. The strength of Solo is one, it's about observed learning. Right? So that's really nice with our notion that learning needs to manifest in behavior change. Right? So it's what we can see in learning. The other thing too is it's not confounded by context. So unlike other learning taxonomies, Bloom's taxonomy, that he has a discrete taxonomy for cognition, a discrete taxonomy for affect, and a discrete taxonomy for psychomotor, which isn't well tested either, by the way. And what it does is it confounds that you have to jump between these different taxonomies depending upon the learning outcome. Solo allows you to understand learning regardless of what you're looking for. Right? I'm going to talk you through it in a minute. The other thing too is it allowed us to have a double win. The first win is that we could satisfy people who are interested in amount, who wanted to quantify learning, which is great, right? We could put it on a scale from 0 to X and everything on between, and we could apply modern test theory to discriminate performance based upon that. But the other thing it did is it allowed us to speak to the quality of learning that was being undertaken. And this was important because in sport and public health, they were always about norm referenced, where do they sit on the bell curve, right? But people who are interested in learning are less concerned about normalizing behavior. They're more concerned about growth and progression, which is why when I reported those bell curves today, it was all about here's how far you shift the curve, not the comparison of the curve. We can talk about surface to deep learning, and what it does is what's more important, surface or deep learning? Trick question, both. To get to deep learning, most of you, nearly everybody, has to go through beginnings. They have to understand the surface elements of a learning imperative if this deep learning is going to be stable. Okay, some progress through it much quicker than others, but we can capture that and speak to the speed in which they accelerate through. And it gives us a way to go forward. So I'm going to talk you quickly through Solo, because all those elements that I put up before are underpinned by that model. I've got about 5 minutes, so I'm going to rush through. So essentially, if you've got your student or your athlete or whoever you're dealing with here, represented by the triangle, and this is their behavioral response at this end. Now, this is information or knowledge they interact with that's related to the task. This is irrelevant information or knowledge they interact with. And here is information that hasn't been presented to them directly through what you're trying to do. So it's some sort of abstraction. You might be a soccer coach, right? And all of a sudden, a child executes a movement that they learnt in athletics. Where'd they get that from? That would be going through that pathway, right? So in terms of the scaffold, so we took all those elements that we put on the periodic table around physical literacy, and we mapped them in terms of the learning. So it looked a bit like this. From unistructural, I'm going to flick through this pretty quick. The other ones. These are our 4 levels: unistructural, multistructural, relational, and extended abstract. So at the unistructural level, a student or a person only relies on one piece of information or interacts with a discrete piece of knowledge to inform their response. At the multistructural level, it's 2 or more. It could be 2, it could be 5, it could be 10, it could be 100 pieces of information. The discriminating factor here is that they're all done independent of each other. So if you think about the first one as being a brick of knowledge, at this level they deal with a pile of bricks. They're in no real coherent way. But you can quantify across that because having 5 bricks is better than having 2 bricks. Right? And it's a significant shift. At the third level, when they turn into relational thinkers, what they're doing is they're doing something with those bricks. They're connecting them together, not just have a pile of bricks of knowledge anymore. They build a wall. And they can talk about each of the bricks or use each of the bricks in their behavioral response, but they also use the mortar that holds the bricks together. And then if they make the leap, and this isn't always the case, but we think physical literacy really encourages this, is that they have to be able to make leaps beyond what's presented. They can't just see the brick wall for what it is. It has to be attached as part of a house or a building or a structure. It has to serve a purpose. And to do that, it needs to be coupled with other domains of learning. At the relational level too, what is significant, at the extended abstract level, what else is significant, they may even start to question the knowledge that they're presented with. Right? Why are you building a house out of bricks? It's easier to do it this way. Build it out of iron or steel. It's going to be stronger. So they start to question, and this is where you get shifts, paradigm shifts in the behavior around activity. People who do things, you go, wow, Remember the first time Fosby decided to actually go backwards over the high jump bar? Extended abstract. Yeah? There's the thinking. So we took all that and we mapped each of the elements with a periodization of learning and a descriptor. What the Sports Commission do now, Australian Sport, is every movement sequence we ask you to think of as in the same way you'd think about a chemistry experiment. How do you piece elements together and inform what does this movement experience look like from a physical, cognitive, psychological, affective perspective? And what are the relationships? How much depth of learning is needed to start to swim, for example? Can I just have some basic locomotion, basic stability, a little bit of motivation at a low level? What does it look like by the time that they're 8 or 10 or 12? So every movement sequence is now envisaged as not the element in isolation, but more what's it look like in terms of a compound? And do you need a series of compounds that then become a mixture? So playing sport now is broken down to this atomic level, playing sport, being active, we think about with a very scientific lens in terms of the movement chemistry that's been unfolded in front of us and how we capture that. So that's what I'd ask you moving forward. What does your daily movement chemistry look like? That's all I have time for. So thank you very much.